False prophecy. Biblical texts repeatedly warn against individuals who claim to speak for God without authorization. Deuteronomy 13 and 18 address this directly, distinguishing between prophets whose message leads the community away from covenant loyalty and those whose predictions fail to come to pass. In both cases, false prophecy is treated as a serious breach. Within this historical context, prophets functioned as public interpreters of events, law, and crisis. Claiming prophetic authority carried social power. A false prophet could redirect worship, justify harmful policies, or destabilize communal trust. For this reason, the texts frame false prophecy as a threat not only to belief, but to social order. Narrative examples reinforce the danger. Prophets who promise peace where there is none, or who speak to please political leaders, are criticized for exploiting fear and uncertainty. The issue is not error alone, but misusing sacred language to gain influence. In most mainstream interpretations, false prophecy is treated as cursed because it corrupts the channels meant to guide the community. The boundary being protected is truthful speech about the divine, especially when such speech shapes collective action. Adultery. Biblical law treats adultery as a serious violation of covenantal trust. In legal texts, it is listed among offenses that threaten the stability of family and community life. The concern is not sexual desire in the abstract, but the breach of an established marital bond. Within this historical context, marriage was more than a private arrangement. It structured inheritance, kinship, and economic survival. Adultery disrupted these networks by introducing uncertainty about lineage and loyalty. Because of this, biblical law frames it as a public matter with communal consequences. Narrative texts reinforce this view. The story of David and Bathsheba in 2 Samuel 11-12 presents adultery as the beginning of a chain reaction. What starts as a private act leads to deception, abuse of power, and eventually violence. The narrative focuses less on legal penalty and more on how the act unravels moral responsibility at the highest level of leadership. Later interpretation varies in emphasis. Rabbinic tradition develops strict definitions and evidentiary standards. Christian texts often shift attention toward intention and restoration while still treating adultery as a serious breach of trust. In most mainstream interpretations, adultery is cursed because it erodes the relational structures that sustain family and social continuity. Blasphemy. Leviticus 24 describes blasphemy as the act of cursing or abusing the divine name. In the text, this is not casual or accidental speech. It refers to a deliberate verbal act that publicly attacks what the community holds as sacred. Within this historical context, the divine name represented presence, authority, and covenant relationship. To curse the name was to challenge the moral center of the community itself. The narrative in Leviticus shows uncertainty about how to respond, followed by a formal ruling, emphasizing the seriousness and rarity of the offense. Later, Jewish tradition develops careful practices around speech about God, often avoiding pronouncing the name altogether. Christian texts reinterpret blasphemy debates in light of disputes over Jesus' identity, especially in the Gospels. These later discussions show continuity in concern for reverence, even as interpretations diverge. In most mainstream interpretations, blasphemy is treated as cursed because it uses language to dismantle shared meaning. The boundary being guarded is communal reverence, not emotional offense. Oath-breaking. Biblical texts treat the breaking of solemn oaths as a serious offense, especially when those oaths invoke God's name. Passages in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy warn against making vows carelessly or failing to fulfill them once spoken. Within this historical context, oaths were not casual promises. They functioned as public acts that bound individuals before God and community. To swear falsely or break an oath was to misuse sacred language in order to secure trust, advantage, or protection without intention to honor it. Narrative examples illustrate the weight of oath-making. Leaders and communities are sometimes shown suffering consequences not because of direct violence, but because truth itself has been compromised. The offense lies in eroding trust by treating the divine name as a tool rather than a witness. In most mainstream interpretations, oath-breaking is considered cursed because it damages the moral fabric that allows a society to function. The boundary being protected is integrity, speech that can be relied upon when it matters most. Marks for the dead. Leviticus 19:28 forbids cutting the body or making marks for the dead. In the text itself, the prohibition is narrow and specific. It does not address body marking in general, but bodily practices tied to death rituals. Within this historical context, many ancient Near Eastern cultures practiced ritual cutting or marking during mourning. These acts could express loyalty to the deceased, attempt to ward off restless spirits, or signal participation in ancestor-focused rites. The body became a site of ritual communication with the dead. Biblical law rejects this framework. The concern is not aesthetic alteration of the body, but participation in religious systems that treated the dead as active spiritual agents, requiring appeasement or control. Such practices conflicted with Israel's understanding of death, worship, and divine authority. Later traditions differ in application. Some readers extend the prohibition broadly, while others limit it to ritualized mourning practices connected to pagan religion. In most mainstream interpretations, the curse language functions as a boundary marker. The living are not to bind themselves to the dead through religious ritual. Blood. Biblical texts consistently treat blood as symbolically charged rather than ordinary. In Genesis 9, following the flood, meat consumption is permitted, but consuming blood is explicitly forbidden. The reason given is brief and foundational. The life is in the blood. Within this historical context, blood represented life itself. In the sacrificial system described in Leviticus, blood functions as a visible sign of life offered in place of life. Because of this role, blood is reserved for ritual use connected to atonement and reconciliation, not for ordinary consumption. This boundary also distinguishes Israel from neighboring cultures. In classical sources, some ancient rituals use blood as a means of accessing power, protection, or divine favor. Biblical law rejects these uses. The prohibition does not target meat eating as such, but the treatment of blood as a ritual substance. Later interpretation varies. Jewish dietary law continues to emphasize the draining of blood as a marker of obedience and identity. Early Christian texts show debate over whether Gentile converts should follow this rule, with some traditions preserving it in limited form. Across these readings, blood remains cursed in the sense that it is set apart, removed from casual or manipulative use. The Mark, 666. Revelation 13 introduces what later tradition calls the Mark of the Beast. In the text, the mark is placed on the hand or forehead and is required to participate in economic life. Without it, buying and selling become impossible. Within this historical context, Revelation belongs to apocalyptic literature. This genre communicates through symbols rather than straightforward prediction. The mark is often understood as a visible sign of allegiance rather than a mere object. It mirrors earlier biblical language about marks, seals, and names that signify belonging and loyalty. In most mainstream interpretations, the mark represents submission to a political and religious system that demands worship-like obedience. Economic pressure is central. The text emphasizes choice. Participation brings security, while refusal brings exclusion and hardship. The curse lies not in the mark itself, but in what it signifies: alignment with a power portrayed as opposing God's order. Interpretations vary widely. Some traditions read the passage as referring to future events. Others understand it as a symbolic critique of imperial systems in the first century that fused economic control with emperor worship. Despite disagreement, the shared function of the passage is to warn against trading moral allegiance for survival or prosperity. Idolatry. Biblical texts repeatedly identify idolatry as a central threat to covenant life. Idolatry is presented not only as the worship of physical images, but as the elevation of any created thing to ultimate status. The golden calf episode in Exodus 32 serves as a defining example. Within this historical context, images of gods were common throughout the ancient Near East. They provided visibility, control, and reassurance. The biblical narrative portrays Israel's turn to the calf as a response to anxiety and absence rather than outright disbelief. The problem is not aesthetic representation alone, but the redefinition of authority, deciding for oneself what may stand in for the divine. Narrative and prophetic texts consistently link idolatry with social disorder. Worship of other gods is often followed by injustice, exploitation, or violence. The connection suggests that false worship reshapes values and behavior, not just ritual practice. In most mainstream interpretations, idolatry is considered cursed because it replaces the source of moral order with something that cannot sustain it. The boundary being protected is allegiance, what ultimately commands trust, obedience, and devotion. Unclean foods. Leviticus 11 outlines a list of animals that are permitted for consumption and others that are forbidden. These dietary distinctions form what is often called the kosher food system. Animals that do not meet specific criteria, such as certain types of fish, birds, and land animals, are labeled unclean. Within this historical context, these rules function as visible markers of identity. What a community eats is one of the most consistent ways it distinguishes itself from others. The food laws reinforced Israel's separation from surrounding nations and their religious practices. The concern is less about hygiene and more about symbolic order. Scholars have proposed various explanations for the categories used, including health considerations or symbolic completeness. In most mainstream interpretations, however, the primary function is covenantal. Daily meals become reminders of belonging and obedience. Later interpretation differs sharply. Jewish tradition continues to observe these laws as expressions of faithfulness. Early Christian texts reinterpret them, especially in relation to Gentile inclusion, often treating the dietary boundaries as no longer binding. In both traditions, the curse language does not imply moral corruption, but exclusion from ritual normalcy within the covenant system. Witchcraft. In biblical texts, practices such as sorcery, divination, consulting mediums, and necromancy are repeatedly prohibited. Passages in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy place these activities outside acceptable religious life, sometimes attaching the most severe legal penalties in ancient Israelite law. Within this historical context, these practices were common across the ancient Near East. Kings and households often relied on diviners, omen readers, or spirit specialists to gain knowledge about the future or guidance in crisis. Biblical sources present Israel as rejecting these methods because they represented alternative sources of authority. Guidance was expected to come through covenant channels such as law, prophecy, and prayer, not through ritual specialists claiming hidden power. Narrative texts reinforce this boundary. In 1 Samuel 28, King Saul, who had previously banned mediums, secretly consults one when he can no longer receive guidance through approved means. The story portrays this act not as curiosity, but as evidence of political and spiritual breakdown. The issue is not technique, but allegiance, turning to a forbidden source when trust in the covenant system collapses. In most mainstream interpretations, the prohibition functions to protect religious loyalty and communal coherence. Witchcraft is treated as cursed because it redirects dependence away from the covenant framework that defined Israel's identity.